In 1868, a coalition of clans deposed the Tokugawa shogunate and brought about a revolution from above that would fully bring Japan out of the state of feudal backwardness. This was the Meiji Restoration. In their mind, the rebels had restored the emperor to his traditional power. And in the next 50 years, Japan would develop a modern capitalist economy, a political system based on the German Empire, and a ruthless military that secured Japanese dominance over Asia by defeating both Russia and China in wars. In our timeline, Japan would go on a campaign of conquest to upset the international order and fully bring Asia under its orbit. But in the Kaiserreich timeline, German domination of the East after the Weltkrieg has made Japan much weaker in the international sphere. The trade-dependent island country is now seeing its resources and economy falter ever further, and its politics are not faring any better. Political instability is awash both high and low in society, and already in the early 20s, a regime of martial law was established under Tanaka Giichi. The draconian measures that were imposed by the regime, such as the peace preservation law, led to stiff opposition by moderate civilian leaders who pressured the cabinet until it fell in 1926. This, however, definitely soured relations, whichever were left, between the military, especially the army, and the civilian leadership. 10 years later, and the instability still has not died down, the hostilities continue, and Japan's fragile cherry blossom of democracy could soon shatter and fall. So, welcome back everyone to Kaiserreich. Another Politics Explained video. This time it's going to be Japan. Last time was Russia. So, Japan. How is it? Well, it is a democracy. It does have democratic parties. The two biggest ones are the Minsei-to and the Seiyu-kai. I will probably mispronounce every name in this entire video. These two are what you'd expect. The Minsei-to is a market liberal party, just liberals. Seiyu-kai is a conservative party that's close to the military, whereas the Minsei-to is closer to the civilian establishment, especially the economic conglomerates, the Zaibatsu, that dominate Japanese economics. They're big, giant, mega monopolies that essentially control every kind of production from, you know, little coffee machines all the way to aircraft carriers. And eventually, you're going to have to choose what happens, because it is a democracy, yes, but it's kind of a strange democracy, and I'm going to trail off a little bit. This is not actually scripted at the start. With the way the Japanese political system works, the Japanese political system is based on the 1889 Meiji Constitution, which was, of course, enacted under the rule of Emperor Meiji. This guy's grandfather, I believe, was Meiji Taisho and then Hirohito. Well, essentially that constitution was modeled on the German Empire system. So in Kaiserreich, it's actually quite fitting that the German Empire is still around, because you have an emperor at the top, just like Wilhelm II, and then you have a civilian government and a military that is independent of that government. So the civilian cabinet, while Japan's democracy is still holding, actually has limited power over the military to do what it wants. Also in Japan, of course, in the Kaiserreich timeline, you already had a military regime under Tanaka Giichi. And actually, is Tanaka Giichi still alive in this timeline? I'm not sure. Yes, he is still alive. This guy. So this guy was the dictator of Japan in the Kaiserreich timeline up to 1926. Of course, he's an old general. And he was supported by the old bureaucracy, the Gendro, the oligarchic sort of statesmen that had helped bring about the Meiji Restoration, and then had essentially monopolized Japanese political power since all the way to their deaths. At this point, though, those guys are dead. Those guys were already pretty old by the time they essentially said, okay, that's fine, Tanaka Giichi, you can be in charge. Eventually, what happens is the constitutional restoration happens, and the Seiyu-kai start to monopolize political sort of power around them, because, well, they have the most support in the countryside of Japan, Japan being, of course, still a kind of a rural nation. That's exactly the opposite of what happened in real life. In real life, the Minsei-to actually monopolized the democratic scene. In fact, they continued winning elections all the way up to 1937, despite the fact that from 1932 to 1937, the Japanese political system was sort of a weird sort of combination of military rule and civilian rule, where you still had very regular elections and cabinets forming in and out. But because of the military's independence, whenever a cabinet would have to be formed, an army and navy minister would have to be approved by the army and navy general staffs. So what they could do to simply destroy a cabinet was refuse to provide a candidate. And that's, in a way, what's happening in the Kaiserreich timeline as well. You have a very unstable government under Inukai Tsuyoshi, who in this timeline hasn't been assassinated in the May 15th incident. Or I believe it was in the May 15th, 1932 incident that he was assassinated. Not sure. Anyway, this guy in real life was assassinated a few years before the beginning of the Kaiserreich timeline in a military coup. But in this timeline, of course, you have a little bit of a more stable civilian government, so he's still around. However, there's some various groups of the left wing that are around, especially the Shakai Taishuto, the Social Masses Party, actually participates in elections, being the Social Democrats, they're the biggest. But you also have anarchist and anarcho-syndicalist, blah, 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 elements that every once in a while try to blow up either the emperor or someone else, a little bit similar to how it was in Russia back then, especially in the 1910s, etc., and the 1890s, etc., etc. So it's a similar situation to that, but the military, of course, sees this and sees the very close cooperation of these civilian parties with, for example, the Zaibatsu, so the economic elite, the economic establishment. They see this and they think that they are essentially weakening Japan and Japan's fighting spirit and all of that. So the military sees the civilian parties as weak and the democratic system as both unstable and not fit for Japan. Some elements of the military support a cooperation with the political and economic establishment. So you have this line of military centralism and the Yokusei-ha faction that we'll talk about later. And that ends up leading down... what I also like is, like, about the focus tree is how much it conveys how the Zaibatsu are just very, very important. And after you finish all of the political stuff, that's what you get into how to deal with the Zaibatsu. So those would be the guys that end up supporting the Zaibatsu. What they want to do is to establish essentially a corporatist state. Some of them want to actually completely mobilize the economy for total war, because they think that this way they're going to provide Japan with stability and security. This faction is mostly supported by Central Army leadership, the high command, and it is known as the Central Faction. It's one of the factions that Japan has in the military. There's another faction called the Restorationists. I'm not even going to try to pronounce them. One of them is called the Chushuha or something like that, and that would be the Central Faction. And the other one is called the Ishin-ha. That would be the Restoration faction. What they want to do is to essentially militarize society and essentially take power away from the economic interests and the bureaucracy and return it to the emperor, at least formally. Of course, military rule backing it up. Because they see the oligarchical system that Japan has developed into as essentially hijacking power from the emperor, which is what, for them, Japanese system is supposed to be. Of course, it's supposed to be the empire, the imperial rule. And so what they propose is a radical reforming of society with the emperor at the top. What they call, of course, the Showa Restoration, because that is disguised as, I don't know, the Japanese emperors have different names. So this is the, name, imperial name, I guess you could say, of Hirohito. They want is the Showa Ishin, the Showa Restoration. And if the military seizes power and the democracy fails, which I'll get to right now, I have the saves set up right for this, if the game will allow me to. Alright, should be this one. Which happens, by the way, if the political system is unstable enough. Now, this is sort of a guide, but sort of not really a guide. It's more of a presentation and an introduction. But essentially what you do is you try to destabilize the democratic political system as much. For example, with the election event that you get at the start of the game, you pick the option of like a political deadlock, etc., etc. You end up getting this longest day focus. And this would be the coup of the military high command. After that, so it would be the central faction, which is modeled, by the way, on the control faction, the Toseiha, in real life. Then the junior officers in Tokyo make another coup, and that would be the Showa Restoration event. So they counter-coup the coup, and they take over, and the emperor supports them. This is different from our timeline. In our timeline, the Tokyo officers did stage a revolt. That was the 26th incident, the February 26th, 1936 coup. But it fails because the emperor does not support them. Well, partially because of that. There's a lot of things going on there. And you get this part, because, of course, the military presents a united front against the democratic factions. But it is not a united force in the politics of Japan at all. It's got various interest groups, factions within it, as we already saw. And of course they've got civilian allies and corporate leaders that are still around who want their piece of the pie. And apparently I loaded the wrong save. I'm sorry. That is definitely breaking the usefulness of this presentation. Anyway, so what happens then? So the various factions and the interest groups who were, of course, presenting the united front are now starting to infight. And there's the three main factions that end up coming to the fore, right, in the political scene. That would be these three that you can see. The first one is the Kodoha. These are the Imperial Way faction under Araki Sado. And they're mostly popular with the Restorationists, so the younger officers who come from a less privileged background, who have enacted the second coup. They want to radically sort of reshape the Japanese society, and they're mostly opposed to the Zaibatsu plutocracy. So what they want to do is, of course, restore power to the emperor while nationalizing the economy and enacting land reforms, as you can see. And they're, again, most popular with the kind of officers that have formed the Restoration faction, because they are the ones who want to sort of restore Japan's traditional place as much as possible. Then you have the Yukoseiha, who are a faction of ex-parliamentarians. These are the ones that are essentially the extreme right wing of the parliamentary scene. They still want to keep the system in a way that is similar to what the old one was, because that's, of course, where there were an economic and political elite. And they want to collaborate, of course, with the Zaibatsu, who are their main source of support, both, I guess, financially and politically. They're also very, very much opposed to nationalization because of this. So these two definitely don't like each other very much. They see each other as very, very bitter rivals. But they both dislike the Kakushinha faction, who would be the Reform faction. And the Reform faction, which would be, in a way, the closest to what happens in our timeline, Japan, they are a little bit different. They are supported by also the military high command, so they're very, very high, and a few intellectuals, who, of course, theorize a total control of Japan by one society, the Imperial Rule Assistance Association, or Taisei Yukosantai. So what they want to do is they want to create effectively a party state in which every executive, legislative, and administrative function is going to be essentially concentrated. So from a neighborhood, like, school theater group all the way to the Bureau Cabinet, these guys want to concentrate and centralize and insert in the framework of this Imperial Rule Assistance Association every sort of, I guess, association, group, interest, concern in Japanese society. They're not necessarily opposed to the Zaibatsu, but they just want to regulate them along the needs of a corporatist kind of society where Japan is mobilizing for, of course, conflict, and they want to have the Zaibatsu being very, very much under their control. In fact, they want to incorporate the Zaibatsu into the state as in the framework of the Imperial Assistance Association and the sort of new system that they want to create for Japan. So these are the three main factions. If you have the democracy win, you're going to have regular elections. I believe you can have... okay. So what you can have is you can have, in the elections, you can have the Seiyukai win, you can have the Minseito win, so conservatives and liberals, but you can also have the Social Democrats, the Shakai Taishuto win. I believe there's no way to get Japan to be syndicalist, but I'm not sure. There's possibly a way to do that. I'm pretty sure that, however, in Kaiserreich for Hearts of Iron 4, there's no way to get Japan syndicalist. In DH there was, but it's not DH. This military centralism line is one of the ones that you see rarest. There's a very convoluted path to get in there. Essentially, you have to, as a player, want to defend democracy, but you have to fuck up some things so that eventually the emperor will not support essentially the maintaining of democracy and will, tell to go ahead for a military coup. And these are very much close to the Yokusei-ha faction and a little bit to the Kakushin-ha. So these are just like the very, very high levels of military rule that would want to keep Japan mobilized, militarized, but perhaps not as, politically radical as something like a Kodo-ha faction or a Kakushin-ha faction. And then the Showa Restoration, of course, is, well, as you've seen. So this is basically the political part of the Japanese focus tree. Then you go down and you enact a different kind of economic policy depending on what you chose. If you choose the Kodo-ha faction, you can nationalize the Zaibatsu. Also, if you choose everyone but these guys, you can nationalize the Zaibatsu. And then that leads down into a lot of factories, of course, and a land reform. Actually, no, these ones are all... Yeah, you can do all of these. But yeah, you get a lot of factories, essentially, and not a lot of bonuses. Whereas if you choose anyone, you can go with the Bureaucratic Economy. That is, of course, I guess the East Asian economic characteristics. You can always have a lot of lovely, lovely bureaucracy. And you can even integrate, like, Ford, etc. And the United States will not like that. So this is a lot of everything, and some oil as well. Then you can support the Zaibatsu. That would be the program of the Yokusei-ha faction, so the bureaucratic, parliamentarian hardliners. And they end up getting you a lot of different things. Especially important are these resources and this research time, just showcasing the collaboration of the big sort of conglomerates into the society. Then you get to go down and enact these land reform acts, because at this story, Japan does have a little bit of a land countryside kind of issue. What they have is a lot of economic problems due to the rural countryside being essentially lagging behind the central cities that are just modernizing at a very, very fast pace, and so the countryside is in crisis. Also because there's the Funtian, Manchurian government that is kind of friendly to Japan, so there's a lot of trade coming through. There is the South Manchurian Railway Corporation, the Mantetsu, that is extracting massive profits from Manchuria by essentially transporting both food and materials to this place, Port Arthur, or Dairen as it is in Japanese, and from there exports coming into Japan, of course, of cheap Manchurian products, are definitely hurting the countryside economy of Japan. So you need land reform. Mostly this is just events that happen to you, and it's kind of okay. They reduce some modifiers that you have otherwise. Do I have any right now? No, but they also give you some other modifiers. And yeah, you also have this Land Adjustment Act, which would be about nationalizing land, essentially, to just get better usage out of it. And then there's colonial incentives, which eventually give you cores. It takes a long time, though, on some parts, I believe, of Korea, Kwantung, which would be the Liaotung Peninsula, this one, and down here Formosa, or Taiwan. So yes, and of course, if you go down the foreign policy stuff, I'll just quickly take a look at it, even though it's not really the focus. In fact, this whole thing could probably be its own video. Once you have finished all of your political infighting, in fact, after 1937 period, although I would advise you to finish at least this first part of the national focuses before going down this route. You can get the Rising Sun and not Fading Sun. I wonder what that Fading Sun is. I think if you like have way too many political infightings and eventually you just don't take this, you get this Fading Sun event and then you're just stuck being isolationist. But oh well, I don't really remember how to do that. You can have, of course, your own faction, the co-prosperity sphere, which is very, very different to what it was in real life. But again, this is another video that could be on its own, explaining what the co-prosperity sphere was and how it worked. The German Goliath must be brought down, because that's the main difference between our timeline and the Kaiserreich timeline. The Germans are all over, instead of the British and the French and in part the Americans. So there's a lot less problems with America, because, well, you have the American Civil War. And so America really isn't that much of an issue for Japan, which is very, very good, because of Japan in real life did not really have the strength to take on the Americans, but you can do quite a lot against the Germans. You can, of course, you can have the Great Railway Incident, which is a little bit of a nod to the Mukden incident in real life. They will, stage an incident in the Tianjin concession, which would be around here. And you'll have our railway fakely blown up, and that would be a pretext for war with the Qing Empire. You can also have a big giant war with the Germans over their East Asian colonies. Of course, kind of what happened in World War I with Japan. They wanted, the Shandong Peninsula. They wanted the Micronesia. They wanted the Papua New Guinea, etc. All of this stuff for themselves. And so they went to war with the Germans. All of that. You can also then choose between, after you either, or even before, but this is really the main part. You can also decide if you want to attack the Russians or if you want to attack into the Pacific. Into the Pacific, you can get Indonesia, you can get Hawaii, and you can get the Philippines. This is relatively easy because the Philippines breaks off from the United States when the Civil War happens, and usually they're just independent. Sometimes you're going to have a coup, syndicalist coup, or rather revolution, and the Philippines succeed, which is very rare, actually, from the AI. And in that case, I think they have an option to join the Third International. But, hey, what's the International going to do on the other side of the world? So, yeah, it's not really that much of a problem. Indonesia, usually part of the, Dutch Empire. The problem is, for the Dutch, often they have a revolution happen in their own country, so Indonesia gets to break off. If Indonesia gets to break off, it's relatively easy to take them down. And then Hawaii, of course, once America breaks off, you can get Hawaii, and, well, let's just say that Japan getting a Hawaii over there just kind of secures your eastern flank and domination of the Central Pacific. So that is, of course, solving a lot of strategic problems for you. Attacking north, you, of course, have the option of going after the Russians and the Mongolians as well, actually. Despite the fact that Sternberg initially was supported by Japan, especially during the Russian Civil War, and a little bit now as well, it's gotten out of hand. Sternberg does not want to be controlled, and so you're going to have to deal with him. The problem is you have a lot of these puppets strewn about all over. So when you advance either into Russia or into Mongolia, you're going to have to deal with the demands of your puppets. So Transamur, of course, is an exiled Russian government under Alexander Kolchak, the Verkhovny Pravitelь, the supreme ruler. And he wants to take back, at this point it's the throne, because in this game it's Russian Empire. He wants to take back the presidency of Russia, and he's accepting Japanese overlordship for now to do it. So he's a kind of a loose cannon. You get to deal with him in some ways as well. The Fijian government is also a exiled government. It is the exiled government of China. They were exiled by the Germans in the Kaiserreich timeline. In the Kaiserreich timeline, you have the the Chinese Republic, the one that was founded by Sun Yat-sen in 1911. Eventually, that gets destroyed by Germany when they intervene, and they put Puyi, who in real life was actually the emperor of Manchukuo up here, Manchuria. So you have the roles being reversed. You have Puyi in China, and then you have a civilian government of the Republic of China up here, which is why this Fijian government has the 5 races under one flag, or at least a variant of it. As you can see, it's got four little stripes of color plus a yellow thing. That's a variant of the 5 races under one flag that the Chinese had, the Chinese Republic had in this timeline, or rather this time period in real life. And what you can have is that whenever you're advancing into Mongolia or into China, of course you're going to have to deal with the fact that this Zhang Zuolin, this marshal, is not really your puppet. I mean, it says autonomous dependency, and it technically is considered a puppet, as you can see, but it's a very, very loose sort of dependency. This guy is kind of independent, and so he's got his own ambitions in China. He can break off of you, and even he can decide to, whenever you're advancing into Mongolia, this Chahar province and also this Suiyuan province. This is all part of Neimengguo, Inner Mongolia. So, well, I mean, it would be part in real life. And this other part of Mongolia is known as Outer Mongolia, because it would be the one that's not part of the Chinese Empire in history. So the Inner Mongolia is populated by Mongols, but it's fairly well integrated into Chinese society. It was under Beijing's rule for a long, long time. It's in a way within the Great Wall, even though the Great Wall is right over Beijing. So the problem with this is that if you're attacking into Mongolia, if you want Mongolia to be your little puppet, you're going to have a conflict with the Fijian government over who's actually, the overlord of this area, who controls Chahar, who controls Suiyuan, and all of this. Similar things can happen when you're advancing into the Qing Empire. And yeah, that's why the whole game is very interesting as Japan. Also, what I like about the northern strike forces, so the ones to go into Mongolia and Russia, is that yeah, it's very, 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 very difficult to advance into Russia. Even if Russia is as weak as it usually is in Kaiserreich, it's just such a slog, and it represents well just how insane it was for Japanese to even think about going into Russia, that this weakened Russia in Kaiserreich, can deal with them. Just imagine like the Soviet Union in real life, etc., etc. So that's about it. I want to thank you all for watching. I hope you've enjoyed. This one wasn't as well done as the Russian one. I'm sorry, but I don't know as much about Japan, and well, I didn't have as much time to actually research it all, / put the video in some cool little edits, but hope you've enjoyed anyway. Oh god, that's a video rendering in the background, I'm sorry. Anyway, if you want to support the channel, etc., blah, 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 you can subscribe, and there's going to be more videos like this soon. By the way, if you have an idea for which country these kinds of videos should be done next, do tell me in the comments down below. So I'll see you soon. Have a nice one.